Hello everyone and welcome to the ultimate 11th Doctor Sonic Screwdriver Showdown. You may be wondering just what exactly that means, so allow me to explain. I'll be comparing the 4 replicas of the Matt Smith era Sonic Screwdriver that are currently on the market. The Rubbertoe Replicas, the Celestial Toystore, the Wand Company, and the character options. I'll put them in a head-to-head matchup, weighing the strengths and weaknesses of each against the others. In order to keep it as objective as possible, I've instituted a scoring system, and the winners are determined by the numbers, rather than subjective assessment. Of course, no review can ever be 100% objective, but I'll do my very best to back up all my assertions with hard data. Here's how it's going to work. Each Sonic will be judged in 7 categories, with a varying number of subcategories judged within each category. For each subcategory judged, the Sonics will be ranked and awarded 1 to 4 points. The best Sonic in a given contest will be awarded 4 points, while the worst is awarded 1. No ties are allowed. If a Sonic lacks a feature being judged, that Sonic will be awarded a 0. The maximum attainable score is 100 points. Here are the categories. Build quality will be worth up to 16 points. Accuracy will be worth up to 40 points. Flickability will be worth up to 8 points. Functionality will be worth up to 4 points. Serviceability will be worth up to 12 points. The electronics will be worth up to 16 points. And price will be worth up to 4 points. Now, yes, accuracy does count for 40% of the contest all on its own. You may value other aspects more, but this review is geared toward prop replica collectors, not cosplayers or anyone else. And remember, if you'd like a straight review of one of these Sonics, click the Sonic you'd like to see the review of now. You can come back here later if you like. So without further ado, here's the showdown. First, let's look at build quality. Looking at the materials, the CT takes the top spot, as it is clearly made from high quality copper, aluminum, brass, and leather, and also features a robust updated resin for the lens and core. 4 points. The Rubbertoe comes in next with the same high-quality copper, aluminum, brass, and leather, but some fragile resin, which resulted in a unit received with 1 cracked core and 1 chipped core. 3 points. Next is the Wand Company, which is made from a cast zinc with a shiny copper plating in some areas and plastic elsewhere. 2 points. And last place in materials goes to the CO with its purely plastic construction. 1 point. On to construction methodology. CT once again takes the top spot with a robust threaded construction that allows access where needed but prevents harmful tampering or accidental misalignment. 4 points. The runner-up position goes to the Wand Company. It is solid and robust and functions as it should while doing its best to hide the inner workings under the Sonic that you actually want to see. 3 points. Next is the Rubbertoe, which has decent construction, but the leather handle section is off-kilter, if you can see that right there, and has a gap with visible wires under the activation switch, as you can see here. Additionally, changing the batteries exposes the inner workings, which is not ideal. 2 points. Bringing up the rear is the CO, which is injection molded plastic with obvious seam lines and an unnecessarily visible battery hatch. 1 point. Now to have a look at claw fit. As one of the more finicky parts of the Sonic, how well these are assembled is going to be important to the longevity of your replica. Leading the pack is the Wand Company, whose claws simply do not move side to side. They open as intended and have no other give. 4 points. The runner-up for this category is the CT, which has minuscule, almost non-existent sideways give in the claws. 3 points. Showing up next with a considerable amount of wobble to the claws is the CO. 2 points. And, quite a surprise in this placement, the Rubbertoe comes in behind the plastic toy this time, with claws about 50% more loose than even on the CO. 1 point. Moving down to the upper cage strut assembly, low-quality materials actually work as a benefit here because they don't require as much space to overcome friction in order to function. To that end, the CO actually leads the pack as the cage assembly here is uniform with no noticeable gaps and absolutely zero wiggle. 4 points. Next is the Wand Company, which is also uniform with no noticeable gaps, but does have a minor amount of wiggle. 3 points. The CT comes in next with a uniform construction lacking any noticeable gaps and a wiggle only a tiny bit more than the Wand Company's. This was a hard placement because this wiggle is definitely a necessity to allow the metal parts to slide open properly, but if we're measuring the amount of wiggle, it does have a tiny bit more than the TWC, so 2 points. Dead last in this category is the Rubbertoe, and it's so far behind the rest of the pack that I wish I could separate it from them by more than 1 point. But that's not how my scoring works. The aluminum struts are inconsistent, sometimes misshapen, as you can see here. Some of the copper struts are attached at a slight angle, like this one. All the struts are too narrow, resulting in unsightly gaps and a major back and forth wiggle. This is not an issue of tolerances to allow movement. This is shoddy, plain and simple. And this is an endemic problem because I have recently learned that Nick Roboto will be offering wider copper struts to fill the gaps and installing them for free. But the customer will need to pay for parts and post. 1 point. Now we're going to move on to the category with the most points up for grabs, accuracy. Now I know there are a lot of people who will say, the Rubbertoe is made by the same guy who made them for the show, so that's going to be 100% accurate and should get the full 40 points. If you're one of those people, let me tell you right now that you are wrong. Being made by the original prop maker is awesome, undoubtedly, but it is not a guarantee of accuracy. Now, they may well be very accurate to the very last season these were used in, as they essentially use some of these replicas as the filming prop. But using an MFX Sonic in the 50th anniversary special doesn't make that piece of crap retroactively accurate, and the same applies here. I'm using as my main point of reference the 4 original filming props from 2010. These props have changed over time in ways big and small, but these were the ones seen on screen for the vast majority of the time this Sonic has been around. I've been researching this prop for 5 years, and when I'm saying that something is inaccurate, I will back that up with photographic evidence. One other quick note before we get started, the original Pommel was hinged with a concealed button. That was done away with toward the end of Matt Smith's time as the Doctor and replaced with a solid pommel. I will consider both of these as accurate, as the hinged end was never used on screen, so may as well have been the solid piece all along. So with that out of the way, on to the matchup. First, we're going to look at material accuracy and size. The Rubbertoe leads the pack on this one. The size is correct and all materials seem to be accurate to the original props, or at least close enough as to be indistinguishable to anyone who hasn't handled them personally, which is to say, I can't see any differences at all. 4 points. Next in line is the CT. The size is correct and all materials are high quality and accurate to the props, except the resin parts have been upgraded for better durability, and the leather is a nicer grade than what was used on the props. 3 points. Next up is the Wand Company, which, to start, is slightly oversized. Materials-wise, it is composed mainly of metals, but it's a toy-grade cast zinc rather than pure milled copper and aluminum. 2 points. And lastly, we have the CO, which is oversized and made completely of plastic, having 0 material accuracy to the props. 1 point. Now I'm going to have a look at the accuracy of the Sonics piece by piece, moving from the top down. Starting with the claws. This is a hard one to judge because there were 4 original props, all hand-milled without the use of a CNC machine. This means that there are essentially 16 unique claws with variances small or large on the original props. So if the claws from one of these replicas match any images of the original props, I consider the overall shape accurate. But there are other factors to consider to determine the ranking. So the most accurate claws are the CT claws by a nose. The overall shape is accurate to at least one of the filming props. The hinge end slots here are a bit shorter than on the props to allow for better action, and they are centered here, which is accurate. The hinge brackets are the proper shape, and there are no milling lines on the inside of the claws. 4 points. Next up is the Rubbertoe. The overall shape is accurate to at least one of the filming props. The hinge end slot is the correct length, but some are slightly off-center, as you can see here. The hinge brackets are squared instead of having the corners knocked off, and a milling line runs down the length of the inside of the claws for some reason. Overall, they look great, but there are 3 small things to criticize versus 1 small thing on the CT, so Rubbertoe gets the 2nd place spot, 3 points. 3rd place goes to the Wand Company. The overall shape looks pretty weird when the claws are open, but totally fine when they're closed. The hinge brackets are tapered to approximate the shape of the originals, and they're at least the hint of the hinge end slot. The biggest failing of these is that the claws are hollow, which can be seen on the inside when extended. 2 points. Last place goes to the CO. While the overall shape can be considered more or less accurate, it is completely lacking the hinge end slot and proper hinge brackets. The claws on this model as well are hollow. 1 point. Moving on to the lens, the CT takes the top spot again. The swirl has been meticulously recreated, and the color and opacity match to the props, and the shape is perfect. 4 points. The Rubbertoe in the number 2 spot is quite a bit different from the CT. It's more translucent and uses a green LED underneath in place of a white one. These differences are not inaccurate, as replacement lenses were required during filming. Some like these did end up being used quite extensively on the show. Additionally, the swirl on the Rubbertoe lens is very nice. The only flaw is in the overall shape, wherein the top part of the bulb ended up smaller and more round somehow. 3 points. Again, the Wand Company comes up next, having an undersized lens with the wrong shape, and which is totally clear, though that is a necessity for it to function as a remote. It's also missing its grub screw. 2 points. And in last place is the CO, which has a shape even less correct than the Wand Company, also totally clear, with no corresponding functions for it. It is undersized, and it is missing the grub screw. 1 point. Looking at the core, the Rubbertoe grabs the top spot this time, with a beautifully swirled core. Use of the original materials makes this a bit fragile, as the core on my review unit was cracked in one place, there, and chipped in another, up here at the top. That's already been counted against it in build quality, so won't count against it here, but it was worth noting again as a possible issue. There was variance in the core shape on the props, and this can be considered accurate there as well. 4 points. Next in line is the CT. Having used a new core material for increased durability, the swirl pattern is a little hit or miss. Due to being cut from a large piece, some will have more swirl than others. I've seen ones with lots of swirl, and they are beautiful. But as mine is completely lacking in swirl, I'm honor bound to count that against it. The shape, however, can be considered accurate. 3 points. Up next is the Wand Company. The material is clearly a regular plastic, which gives it an overall more flat appearance. They have made efforts to create the swirl pattern pretty successfully. The shape is a little too cylindrical to be considered properly accurate, but definitely not a bad job overall. 2 points. The CO, however, is essentially a straight cylinder that you can see through if you hold it up to the light, revealing a spring and wires inside. No swirl at all. 1 point. Around the core is the upper cage assembly. Looking at that, CT rules the roost again. It is utter perfection. The copper struts are the correct width and are attached perfectly straight. The aluminum struts fit between the copper struts, with only what space is required to allow for freedom of movement needed to extend the Sonic. Even that small space is largely obscured by the inner bevel on the back side of the knurled sections, which are, if you'll see, a satisfying thickness consistent with most of the original filming props, and which features a very appealing and accurate knurling pattern. 4 points. Next up, the Rubbertoe just barely ekes its way into the number 2 spot. This area is the most problematic for this replica. Both the copper and aluminum struts are too narrow, creating hideous gaps in the upper assembly. As previously mentioned, some copper struts are attached at a slight angle. The knurling, while accurate, is far less pronounced, and the knurling section is not as thick. Now, while one of the filming props does exhibit this thin knurling section, it isn't the one with this knurling pattern, but a much tighter one. Though very subtle due to the thinness of the struts, there is evidence of the inner bevel on the back edge. This one really only beats out the Wand Company because the copper struts are actually separate pieces riveted on, and they connect to the collar at the bottom correctly. 3 points. Speaking of the Wand Company, the struts align well and have no gaps and are very close to the correct width. Though 2 of the copper struts are part of the collar ring at the bottom here, they do have molded rivet shapes to pay homage to the construction of the props. The knurling has been recreated decently well for the manufacturing process, but it is even thinner than the Rubbertoe Replicas. It's also completely lacking the inner beveled edges on the back side. 2 points. Bringing up the rear once again is the CO. The copper struts are far too thick, molded as a single piece and lacking any hint of the brass rivets. The cage struts have a decently raised knurled section, with passable knurling giving the manufacturing use. Everything is aligned and lacking in gaps, but the cage struts each have a triangle head screw attaching them to the inner core. 1 point. Now to move on to the inner detailing, which is pretty much just the upper copper cone here and the copper core ring inside the cage assembly. Leading the pack is the CT, with the core ring being in the proper place, coming in contact with the copper struts and almost touching the aluminum struts as on the props. The upper cone is rounded properly and has the correct dimensions. 4 points. Next up, the Rubbertoe has a core ring that is almost identical to the CT, so all good there. The upper cone, however, is much more like a cone with a very sharp angle that terminates abruptly in a plateau. 3 points. The Wand Company approximates that inner core ring with a piece of colored plastic that seems to actually be separate from the core parts above and below it, which is good. Less good is that it is the same diameter as the core rather than coming out to meet with the struts. The upper cone is a bit angular and lacking any plateau. 2 points. Onto the CO, the inner core ring is a molded depression in the core that has been painted copper, is in the wrong location, and is far too thin. The upper cone is too short, but is decently rounded. 1 point. Now, down to the leather handle section, the Rubbertoe has absolutely nailed this. It's the proper shape and size, has the hand stitching along the back, and features the correct activator switch. There is a small gap under the activator switch through which the wires can be seen, but that was covered in build quality. 4 points. The CT leather handle section is very nice as well, though the top and bottom apex are subtly more rounded than on the props. It has the correct activator switch, the hand stitching is present and looks great, and the leather is very nice, but not exactly what was on the props. 3 points. The Wand Company is the correct size and shape, but with an oval button shape molded just above the middle in lieu of the micro switch activator. A very decent approximation of hand stitching has been molded into the back. 2 points. The CO is overall the correct size and shape, though only part of a single piece that runs from the cage down to the pommel. There is no activation switch, which, while very cool functionally, is not accurate. Shoddy fake stitching has been molded in the front, which is interrupted by a stupid extension release button. 1 point. Below the leather handle is a white handle section. In this case, the CT takes it by a nose. It features a very nice yellowed effect, as on the props, with correct grub screw placement and original machining marks molded in. Tiny air holes will eventually get filled with dirt and oil from the hands, increasing the speckle effect, which is precisely how the original props got that look. Absolutely perfect. Next is the Rubbertoe. The yellow is a bit more subtle, which matches with the Sonic earlier on when it hadn't been handled so much. It has the correct grub screw placement and some subtle speckling. It also has the original machining marks in the mold, and here is the only way I was able to pick between this and the CT for the top spot. The detail on those machining marks is ever so slightly softer. The difference between these two is honestly down to looking at it with your eye an inch away. Beautiful. 3 points. The Wand Company comes in third, but with an admirable effort. Though completely lacking the grub, screw, and machining marks, and being slightly oversized, the Wand Company has done a bang-up job on the look of this handle. It's essentially the same off-white as the Rubbertoe with some great speckle action that's nicely subtle. It's probably the highlight of the wand company for me visually. 2 points. The CO, however, is oversized, a flat off-white which is far too bright, missing the grub screw and machining marks, and also features a big-ass battery compartment on the back. 1 point. Onto the pommel, the CT comes out on top again, but only on a technicality. CT and the runner-up, the Rubbertoe, have replicated different versions of the pommel, and I count both as totally accurate. But the scoring here doesn't allow for ties, so the CT gets the extra point for the extra complexity of the part, which also allows for some extra fun if playing around with it is your thing. 4 points. Following, as stated, is the Rubbertoe. Perfect for the version it's replicating, just not quite as interesting as the button version. 3 points. The wand company pommel is very close in size and shape, but a little lacking in detail due to the coating process. 2 points. The CO also has a not at all bad shape and size, but loses out here because of the completely inaccurate removable end piece that was never present on any of the props ever. 1 point. Now, for the last section of the accuracy test, the fixtures, by which I mean rivets and grub screws, or set screws, which may be mainly functional, but also are visual and therefore must be accounted for when gauging accuracy. Here the leader is CT again, as he's used flat brass rivets on the copper struts just as on the original filming props, and every grub screw on those props is present in this replica, despite his updated construction rendering some of these purely cosmetic. 4 points. The Rubbertoe does nearly as good a job, but uses thicker brass rivets for the copper struts that are much more pronounced. Even if we forgive these as being accurate to the later seasons, which may or may not be the case, it's still missing 2 grub screws in the upper cone and uses a different type of grub screw, possibly a hex, in the handle, which ends up looking like an unsightly hole. 3 points. The wand company has no rivets or grub screws, but has molded the rivet shapes into the copper struts to at least give an impression of them. 2 points. The CO, however, has no evidence of any of these. 1 point. Now, I want to talk about one of my personal favorite aspects of this Sonic, flickability. It's a word now, folks. Get used to it. Now, this is probably the most subjective scoring section because I can't show you evidence to back up my claims. This is just something you have to be able to do yourself with the Sonics in your hand. But the results are so clear that I have zero doubt that anyone doing the same test with all 4 Sonics would disagree with me. Now, in addition to the flicking action, I want to test thumb extension. As the Sonic was originally intended to be extended with a thumb, how easily this can be accomplished is a good measure of how well the replica approximates the original. So for the thumb extension, the CT is by far the easiest. Effortless and fluid. 4 points. Next up, the wand company. It's a little harder to get going, maybe because of the thinner knurling, but it goes up quick and smooth once you snag it. 3 points. The Rubbertoe also extends by thumb, but is surprisingly difficult, to the point where you'd never know it was the design intent. Surprising result, honestly. 2 points. The CO, however, does not extend by pushing up on the cage, no matter how hard you try. 0 points. So, moving on to overall flickability, I'm afraid the criteria are a little vague. It's an action that lasts a fraction of a second, but in which several factors affect the overall feel. The force necessary, the smoothness and speed, the sound, the tiny jolt as the travel terminates, the redistribution of weight in your hand. It would be impossible to break down each of the myriad factors that make the flicking experience and rate them individually, so I'll just do my best to summarize the overall feeling. Starting with the CT, which blew me away. The extension is sharp, quick, and satisfying, with a zip and clack that gives off a high energy feeling. It stays in place when you want it to and seems to psychically know when you want to extend it because it feels like it opens when you want it to, regardless of how hard you flick. I know that's not possible, but it gives off that feel nonetheless. Simply exemplary. 4 points. The wand company is a little easier to flick open, resulting in an occasional accidental extension, but the action and resulting sound are nice, especially considering the lightweight zinc used in the construction. Nicely satisfying. 3 points. The results on the Rubbertoe, however, were frankly shocking. The flicking action is so lackluster and limp feeling that most of the time I thought I had only half extended it, only to see that it was, in fact, at full extension. A toss in the air usually produces half-open claws, as will even the slightest jiggle when holding it upside down. It will stay closed upside down if you don't shake it, and that's really all that should be expected of it, but the others went above and beyond in that regard. The overall feeling was so disappointing, though, that I felt the need to skip over the 2-point mark and award this only 1 point. Which I can do because the CO, after 5 years and several revisions, is still spring-loaded and button-activated with no flick action at all, so it gets 0 points. Which takes us to the functionality category, which is honestly not a fair contest at all. I included it because I love running around the house and pretending to Sonic stuff, and I'm sure lots of other people do as well. And that's a lot more fun if stuff genuinely reacts. There's only one Sonic in the bunch that allows for that, and that is the Wand Company, which is a programmable universal remote, but also features a TV Be-Gone, even in FX mode, so you can Sonic a TV when you're out in the world if you so choose, without having to program it first. 4 points. The Rubbertoe, the CO, and the CT all receive 0 points in this category. Speaking of electronics, let's have a look at the electronic features of each Sonic, starting with the LED brightness. Leading the pack here is the CO. Very bright, largely due to the very clear lens. 4 points. Next, the Wand Company, since it also has quite a clear lens, is almost as bright as the CO. 3 points. The Rubbertoe then comes in much lower on the brightness scale, largely due to the lens being pretty clear, but still way more opaque than the others, and perhaps the swirl plays a part there as well. 2 points. And the CT comes in last here, and it trails the Rubbertoe by quite a bit. This is because the earlier, more opaque lens has been recreated. 1 point. Next, we'll test the volume. Here, the Wand Company rules the day with the loudest sound. 4 points. Coming in just a tad under is the CO. 3 points. Now, if you cut the CO's volume about in half, you've got the volume level of the CT. It wasn't built with any viable means for sound to escape, so it only gets 2 points. And then there's the Rubbertoe. Like the CT, this was manufactured without a viable means of sound escape, but unlike the CT, which has a very loud speaker to try to compensate, the Rubbertoe uses the sound module from the CO. Here I had to guess that the volume would be greatly reduced by the metal and leather, as my review unit does not have sound, which costs 140 pounds extra, or roughly $200. Regardless of actual volume, I would place this last just for not having sound as a standard. 1 point. Speaking of the sound, you may notice that on the show, the Sonic doesn't make just a single sound. Rather, there's a core sound that is pitched differently to allow the use of the Sonic to be more dynamic on the show. To that end, I'm looking at the variety of sounds available on each Sonic. The leader by a massive margin here is the Wand Company. With a double press and a bit of a gesture, it offers a total of 12 sounds in FX mode. .4 points. Behind that is the CO, which features 2 alternating sounds, plus a couple hidden ones, such as a sort of faltering Sonic sound. And whatever this is. 3 points. I've got the Rubbertoe in the next position because, using the sound module from a CO, it is reasonable to expect that it has the same variety of sounds, though I cannot confirm. 2 points. The CT features a single sound, so receives 1 point. The last factor to look at in the electronics is latency, the amount of time between hitting the button and getting your lights and sound. The CT has absolutely 0 latency, with sound and lights activating instantly. 4 points. The Rubbertoe has 0 latency on the LED, but I must imagine that the sound version would share the latency of the CO. As I cannot confirm, it gets ranked above the CO, 3 points. The CO has only a slight latency, not too bad at all, but definitely there, 2 points. And the wand company may be suffering from the complex electronics that make it so awesome, as there is a quite noticeable delay between hitting the button and getting sound, 1 point. Of course, if you have any issues with your electronics, it helps to be able to service it a little bit for some routine things like battery changes. To that end, the easiest battery change is the CT. Just unscrew the pommel and pop out a single battery, 4 points. Almost as easy as the Rubbertoe. The pommel unscrews just as easy, but there are 3 batteries and, watch out, that spring is not attached, 3 points. The CO is very easy, but requires a screwdriver. 1 screw, pop off the ugly hatch, and change the 3 button cells, 2 points. The wand company comes in last here as it requires unscrewing the faux collar and undoing 2 small screws, then pull apart and change the batteries, 1 point. When it comes to actually finding the batteries for your Sonic, the wand company gains back some points by taking 2 standard AAA batteries available anywhere at all batteries are sold, at least here in the US, 4 points. Next up is the CT, which takes a single A23 battery. Not the most common size, but I was able to find it with no issues at the shitty Rite Aid up the road from me. So not too uncommon, 3 points. Onto the CO, which takes 3 LR44 button cells. You're not likely to find them at the corner drugstore, but any place that has a halfway decent battery section, like a Best Buy or even a Walmart, should have them, 2 points. Moving on to the Rubbertoe, it takes 3 AG5 batteries, which, here in the US, are nearly impossible to find in a local store. I've always had to order them online. This may be different in the UK or elsewhere, but I can only speak from my own experience, so 1 point. Now, while it should never come to this, if you should ever need to access your LED for any reason, you probably don't want it to be too tough. On the CT, you literally just need to unscrew the lens, as the grub screw is cosmetic. And there's the LED. 4 points. The Rubbertoe is also very simple, but requires a tiny screwdriver. Just unscrew the grub screw and pull off the lens. Voila! 3 points. The wand company and CO are another story. Neither seems to be at all accessible, so they both get 0 points. Lastly, we'll have a look at the price. I personally think that a high-quality replica is worth paying for, but others have different considerations, so here's the breakdown. The CO is obviously the cheapest, being a plastic toy. $30 is so cheap that absolutely anyone can afford it. 4 points. Next is the wand company. At $119, it's about 4 times the price of the CO, but does come with quite the quality upgrade. 3 points. The placement of the next 2 may end up being a little controversial because the Rubbertoe price varies wildly. But I think I've figured it fairly, putting the CT in 3rd place at roughly $1,200, depending on the current exchange rate. To compare apples to apples, it's only fair to consider the cost of the Rubbertoe with sound. Configured with sound, it runs at about $11.85 unless you're in the UK. If you're in the UK, it's going to run an extra 20% in value-added tax, bringing the total to $1,424.36 at the current exchange rate at the time of this video. You'll notice those 2 numbers straddle the price of the CT, so I think it's fair to average them and call the price about $1,300, which is about $85 above the CT. 1 point. So let's have a look at the final scores. With a paltry 38 points out of a possible 100, the CO comes in dead last as expected. It's a toy, folks. If you've watched this whole video and you're considering getting this one, then just bite the bullet, because you clearly don't care about quality and just want something to wave around while you cosplay. Or you're 6. Coming in 3rd place, though far ahead of the CO with 59 points, is the Rubbertoe. I know, this surprised me too. It's just how the numbers came out, but I have to say, it is a great replica. It's got some upper cage issues, and the flicking action was just unbelievably disappointing on my test unit, but if this is a prop you want on display in your home, or you want as a collector's piece, the Rubbertoe is not a bad buy. But if you're looking for something that you can play with a lot, or if accuracy is paramount, then there are better options. Which brings us to our runner-up, passing the Rubbertoe by only 3 points, the Wand Company. This isn't even technically a replica, but a universal remote control. The fun afforded by those remote control features and the excellent flicking action really pushed this one up there, and having had one for a while, I can tell you, at $119, this is a no-brainer for just about anyone. At 1/10 the price of a CT or a Rubbertoe, you get a metallic Sonic with lights and sound that actually functions in a way that emulates the Sonic screwdriver. Wonderful. But the top spot by a significant margin goes to the Celestial Toystore. With direct access to the filming props and 5 years of R&D put into making these, it's no wonder they are even more accurate than those made by the original prop fabricator. The clean machining and painstakingly engineered flicking action really set this Sonic apart from the crowd and make it incredibly satisfying. It may be expensive, but if you care about quality and accuracy, it's worth every penny. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out my individual reviews of these 4 Sonics just by clicking on any of the things you see right now. Just click and it'll go there and you can watch it. They're much shorter videos and much more subjective, so enjoy that, and hey, don't forget to subscribe.